Hello, everybody, and thank you for tuning in to the Liberty Report. With me today is Daniel McAdams. He's the Executive Director of the Institute for Peace and Prosperity. Daniel, good to see you today.
Good morning, Dr. Paul.
Oh, very good. There's still in the news stories about what went on with the Navy and the Iranians, but it looks like it's been resolved. You know, of course, everybody should by now know that 10 Navy personnel were captured or taken once they drifted off into Iranian waters. But they were there for one day, and the headlines are, pretty good, coming back. Iran returns the U.S. sailors to fleet within one day. That sounds pretty good. I mean, considering the fact that we read in the papers all day how bad these people are, it doesn't sound like it's the old days, the Khomeini, when they get hold of Americans. Another headline says Iran releases captured U.S. sailors after questioning, and there was an apology. And of course, you'd think most people should say, hey, that's pretty good. We don't have to have a war over this. We don't have to threaten. We don't have to intimidate. We don't have to bomb anybody. And it seems to have been resolved. And of course, I think there are reasons for that. I don't think it happened by accident. But what do you think's going on, and why do you think it worked out so much better than it might have been 10 years ago or even 5 years ago?
Well, the timing is potentially disastrous because this whole event was unfolding as President Obama was preparing to make his State of the Union address. And so you can imagine State Department personnel, no less than John Kerry, scrambling to try to resolve this problem before it could overshadow the President's State of the Union speech. And so really, thanks to diplomacy, thanks to what's happened over the past year or so, Kerry was able to call up his counterpart, the Iranian Foreign Minister, Zarif, who by the way has a PhD from University of Colorado, so he's an English speaker and familiar with our culture. Called him up. They had no less than 5 phone conversations to try to defuse the crisis, to explain what happened, and to secure the release. This all was done effectively, and as you point out, you think that we would celebrate diplomacy, but the neocons and most of the presidential candidates won't have it that way. They're furious.
Well, yeah, they're furious over this, and you wonder what their agenda is. And I have a map here I'd like to put up to show what I think the agenda is, but hopefully it's shifting the agenda. But we have a long way to go because it demonstrates the difference between intervention overseas and as a foreign policy and one where we have non-intervention. But if the viewers would just take a look at this map, the blue area in the middle, that's Iran. And we don't have any military bases there. When I was in the military and back in the 60s, we had them there. And I actually flew in and out of Tehran because we had bases there and we flew the U-2 out there. But things have changed now. But every place you see a star there on the red, those are military bases, U.S. military bases. They're surrounded. If we had that many foreign bases surrounding us by any hostile nation, China or Russia or anybody, we'd feel nervous about it. So instead of saying that the neocons are saying, well, they overreacted, they treated them like prisoners, they were terrible, they didn't give them steak, they just gave them McDonald's hamburgers and on, but they go into that. But I would think that there's justification for their concern, and I think we should give Obama credit for honestly moving in a direction that we don't have to add more killing to this, and that we don't have an incident like we had in 1979 that lasted for a long time. It took over a year to resolve that. This took a day, and it wasn't like the Iranians were at fault. It was our ship. It's interesting about the boat or the ship, that wandered into the Iranian waters. I keep saying, we can go to the moon and measure the pulse rate and the blood pressure of the astronaut. And I was just wondering, do you think they might not have had a GPS there? Do you think there was a real boat failure? And how did they get them fixed so quickly?
Yeah, that's a mystery. I think there are a lot of mysteries about this story, and you can go into many conspiracies. But, back to the map, I think it's interesting because the neocons say, how dare they board the ship? How dare they interfere with these sailors who happen to be in Iranian waters? But if you think about the bases that surround Iran, you can understand why they would be concerned when a heavily armed naval vessel ventures into Iranian territory. You know, it's also kind of interesting to talk about the hypocrisy of U.S. foreign policy. When Russia may or may not have ventured slightly into Turkey's airspace and Turkey shot down the MiG, the U.S. response was, well, Turkey has a right to defend its airspace. And on this circumstance,
right.
when it's the Iranians defending their territory, their sea territory, all of a sudden it's horrible, how dare they do it.
Well, two other things the neocons are hysterical about. One is that it's costing the American taxpayers $100 billion for this agreement, that we're going to send them this money. They never for once mention that the money was stolen, they're frozen assets, and they're just trying to smooth this over. So, but I bet you most Americans believe that we are financing this, but it's not coming out of the budget. It's coming out of some bank that's been holding this money for them, and now it's going to go back. And the other thing that the neocons are hysterical about is the apology. Mm-hmm. Now, I think apologies in this age that we live are way overplayed. It sort of annoys me when somebody goes back 30 years and found out, oh, you said something and that wasn't nice. And they have to sometimes public TV get on and apologize and driven to tears for this apology. and it's, you know, it's just force and intimidation and grandstanding is horrible. But, you know, if you apologizing and being polite is one thing. You know, if I walk by you or if you walk by me and bump me, I'm sorry or something like that. I put that in that category. You know, our boat went over there and the Iranians stopped it and asked questions and said it doesn't look like it's spying on us, and they said we're sorry, but they're angry and furious that Obama's a monster because of that. Now I can think of some very good reasons to get annoyed with Obama. Matter of fact, even though we have defended him on foreign policy, there's a lot of foreign policy we don't defend him on, especially in Syria and other places, and his economic policies are horrible. But why do the partisan people, even when their policies generally aren't that much different, just have to pile on and pile on? But I think it's fodder for the media as well. You know, they love it, you know, and the fighting and the squirming. And I think they probably are interested in who gets to pull the strings, who are really the people who have the power.
Well, here's another example. I was reading in the Week magazine this morning, and it was a very interesting little piece. But he lays this scenario out. There was equipment failure that rendered a military vehicle inoperative. U.S. military personnel had fallen into the hands of an adversary miles away. How did the president handle it? Did he attack? Did he do this, that, and the other? Well, it turns out he wrote a letter of apology securing the freedom of these U.S. personnel. And this was George W. Bush in April of 2001 when a U.S. spy plane had to make an emergency landing.
I wonder if the Republicans got upset with him as president. You know, but actually, Ronald Reagan can be used for, for taking a position less hostile, even though, he was mixed on some of these issues. But he was able to negotiate with the Soviet Union in a reduction of armaments, and that certainly helped. And that more or less led into the day that the Soviet system collapsed. I don't believe the Soviet system collapsed because we had more armaments. I think that's a tale told by the military-industrial complex. The real reason for that was the fact that communism and radical socialism is a failed economic policy, and I hope that lesson of the 20th century holds, because that certainly was the major lesson. But anyway, this whole thing about negotiating, why can't they? I used to say in the campaign, some of you guys, the other candidates, you're terrified that peace will break out. And so I was very optimistic in 1990 as the Soviet system collapsed, and it helped a little while, but it looks like we've thrown that out. And yet Russia is the biggest oil producer in the world today and provides so much of oil and gas for Europe. And yet we're still looking for reasons to antagonize and fight with them. But one of these days that's going to be resolved, and I think sometimes it's going to be financial, because you hear hints of Russia and China maybe buying and selling oil in something other than dollars. Now that's esoteric and nobody wants to talk about it, but it could turn out to be a big deal.
Yeah, on Monday, some of the sanctions are scheduled to start being relieved on Iran. And so this is the beginning of the implementation on the U.S. side of the Iran deal. And I think that might be some reason we're seeing such a flurry of activity. The neocons are in panic mode. The Republicans are in panic mode about this because peace may break out. Interestingly enough, there was a bill on the floor this week, H.R. 3669, I think it is. And the intention of the bill was to throw a monkey wrench in this automatic lessening of sanctions starting on next week. And it was about if Iran continues its ballistic missile program and if it continues sponsoring terrorism, then all bets are off. Interestingly enough, and I'd never seen, I don't know if you've ever seen this in your much more years in Congress, but I don't remember seeing this. They took the vote to the floor yesterday. After 15 minutes, Paul Ryan gavelled it. There were not enough members present. The excuse was he was enforcing the tardiness rule, but the effect was that the vote was vacated and it won't be taken again up until after the sanctions begin to relieve on Monday. So it's kind of interesting. It could be a coincidence, but it's very...
Maybe the vote wasn't going his way. That might have been it, and that is an excuse. But they certainly are going to argue the case that the Iranians are the bad guys, and they're far from perfection. But are we perfect? I mean, this spreading American exceptionalism, I mean, how do we do that? And sometimes I think we come up real short, but it certainly can be used for demagoguing. And I think we face something here like the Iranians probably face. I think there are a lot of Iranians who are a lot more radical than the ones right now who seem to be moving, and Rouhani types are more moderate. The same thing with this. But in this country, it's a mixed bag because the people who are more sensible are slightly more reasonable when it comes to foreign policy, and then the hawks go nuts, and they start clamoring, we want more confrontation, with the Iranians.
No, I think that's a good point. I'm sure there are hawks on both sides. I'm sure the Iranians, they have a balancing act too, because there are more radicals who are skeptical of improving relations.
Because of Islam and association with Iran, and they do have some that believe in Sharia law, and yet nothing like our closest ally, Saudi Arabia. They're much worse. And just think how often Saudi Arabia has been involved in terrorist attack and in 9/11 and this sort of thing. But the Iranians, even though they have their interests, sometimes they get blamed for not really doing much, like in Yemen. They're not really sending troops or anything else there. But they have their interests, obviously, but they don't, they're not known for suicide terrorism. I would, really challenge somebody to go and look. There probably is somebody there that did it, but it isn't radical Islam that is the number one reason for suicide terrorism. And, Robert Pape,
yes.
You remember him, who would come and lecture for us. He's the one that did the research to find out that the number one most important cause of suicide terrorism is occupation. And of course, when we were occupying and we're reoccupying Iraq, and now there's more suicides committed, he has a fantastic book out, about this. But to paint Iran into that same category, it doesn't bear fruit, but it doesn't fit the neocon arguments. What they want is to, have the confrontation. And I would like to think it's so simple, it's just for profits, but obviously it has to do with profits for the military-industrial complex. But there's others who just do it because they think, that's what we have to be. We are America, and it's our responsibility. We are this good nation, and we should be the policemen of the world. And they don't ever once challenge themselves and say, maybe occasionally we don't have the moral high ground. And I think I would like to go ahead and challenge the audience to think about all these events on who has the moral high ground. And sometimes it's very hard because neither sides have a very high moral high ground. But when countries aren't invading other countries, or another country goes 6,000 miles to antagonize and provoke other people, and many American lives are lost and trillions of dollars of our money spent, they ought to say, maybe the foreign policy of interventionism isn't the best way to go. And obviously that's been our argument all along. That is a dangerous argument. It's an entangling alliance that we have so often. It was advised strongly by our founders not to get involved in this. And I just think that this is a slight movement away from the disaster of a radical interventionist foreign policy that has come about, with this agreement with Iran. Matter of fact, if I had my ways, we wouldn't have had any original sanctions, international sanctions on Iran. So therefore you have to use an international forum maybe to remove those. But quite frankly, we should set a standard by being friends and trading partners with those who want to be friends with us and stay out of the entangling alliances and do our own business to set a standard of free markets and individual liberties. And I'll tell you what, I think we'd be better off, we'd be a lot richer, and then a lot more Americans would still be alive. And that is the goal that we should have, and we should get away from this blame game and deciding that even when somebody gives an inch, you shouldn't have to come down and say, oh, well, they're monsters and we're not even going to give them an inch. Think more about non-interventionism and what the true American foreign policy ought to be. I want to thank everybody for tuning in today to the Liberty Report, and please come back soon.